everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're tackling the impact of some Texas legislation restricting gender-affirming care for minors.
Yeah, it's been a hot topic.
For sure. And we'll be focusing on an article from the Texas Tribune called "After Texas Banned Puberty Blockers and Hormones for Trans Kids, Adults Lost Care Too."
Right, and we'll be looking specifically at how these laws, while aimed at minors, have had some unintended consequences for trans adults.
So before we get into the specifics, can you give us a quick rundown of what kind of gender-affirming care we're even talking about here, and I guess why it's become such a political battleground?
Absolutely. So when we talk about gender-affirming care for minors, generally, it's a range of treatments that help align a person's physical characteristics with their gender identity.
Okay,
Things like puberty blockers, which, as you might guess, temporarily pause the development of secondary sex characteristics. And then also hormone therapy, which introduces hormones like testosterone or estrogen.
to kind of help with those changes. Yeah.
Exactly, to induce changes that are more aligned with the individual's gender identity.
And just to clarify, these treatments are provided with the consent of the minor and their parents, right?
Yes, always.
Okay,
And of course, under the supervision of medical professionals, it's a big decision
of course.
made in consultation with, healthcare providers, mental health professionals, the family. It's not something anyone enters into lightly.
Got it. So, with all that said, what's the thinking behind pushing to restrict these treatments for minors? What are lawmakers trying to do?
Well, there are a few main arguments that come up from people who support these restrictions.
Okay.
One is that minors aren't mature enough to really make informed decisions about their gender identity, and that by giving them access to this care, it could lead to irreversible changes that they might regret when they're older.
So it's about the ability to consent and the potential for regret down the line.
Exactly. Another argument is that gender-affirming care is experimental, and we just don't have enough long-term research on the effects.
Okay.
So they bring up concerns about potential physical and psychological risks.
That's an interesting point. Has there been any pushback from the medical community?
Definitely. You've got major medical organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Medical Association. They've come out very strongly in support of gender-affirming care for minors,
Oh, wow.
citing a growing body of evidence that demonstrates these treatments can be safe and effective when they're provided appropriately.
That makes sense.
And they also highlight the mental health benefits for transgender youth, like reducing rates of depression and suicidality.
So it's a clash between what medical professionals are saying and what lawmakers are doing.
Exactly. And it puts trans youth and their families in a really tough spot.
For sure. And this tension is playing out in courts all over the country, right?
Absolutely, as legal challenges to these laws are happening more and more.
Wow.
People against these restrictions say they violate the constitutional rights of transgender youth and their families. Things like the right to privacy, equal protection, and access to health care.
It sounds like a very complicated legal situation with huge implications for trans rights everywhere. But for now, let's get back to Texas and this specific legislation.
Okay.
You mentioned that these laws, while they're directed at minors, have actually ended up impacting trans adults, like the case we'll be looking at today.
Right, with Colin Zicko. So one of the unintended consequences of the Texas legislation has been a chilling effect on healthcare providers.
Interesting. How so?
Well, they're facing the threat of investigations lawsuits, even losing their licenses.
Wow.
So some doctors who provide gender-affirming care have just decided to leave the state or stop offering these services entirely.
Because of the law.
Yeah, it's created this environment of fear and uncertainty.
And that, in turn, impacts everyone needing that care.
Exactly, adults, too,
Right.
regardless of age.
So it's a ripple effect.
It is. And that brings us to Colin's story. He'd been receiving hormone therapy for years when this legislation passed. He was finally in a good place both physically and mentally. But then his doctor, who treated both minors and adults, left the state.
Because of this law.
Exactly because of the climate created by these laws.
So his care was disrupted even though he was an adult.
Yeah, he's a perfect example of that ripple effect we're talking about.
Okay, I definitely want to hear more about what happened to him, but first let's rewind a bit. Who is Colin Zicko? And what led him to seek gender-affirming care?
Colin's story is really one of resilience. He came out as trans at 14, but he didn't have his family's support back then.
Oh, wow.
He actually calls those years his tunnel years.
Tunnel years.
Yeah, because he felt trapped and isolated, struggling with gender dysphoria without the care he needed.
That must have been so hard being a teenager and feeling so out of sync with your own body.
It was.
Yeah.
He tried everything to manage his dysphoria. binding his chest, extreme dieting, anything to try to control how his body was developing.
It's heartbreaking to think about a young person going through all that just to feel okay in their own skin.
It is. It took a toll on his mental health. So when he turned 19, he was finally able to get in touch with doctors at Dell Children's Medical Center in Austin. And he was able to start hormone therapy.
That's great.
It was life-changing for him. He talks about it as finally quieting this constant noise in his head about his body. The article even has a quote where he says, "Gender dysphoria is a lying little bitch."
Wow. You can really hear the relief in his words. So he was able to access hormone therapy as an adult, and it sounds like it really made a positive difference in his life.
It did. And that's what makes the disruption of his care due to this legislation aimed at minors all the more upsetting.
Right, because this wasn't just about some political debate for Colin.
Yeah.
It was about his health.
Exactly.
So what happened when his doctor left Texas? Was it easy to find another provider?
Not at all. He had about 2 months worth of testosterone left. And he immediately started making calls to clinics and specialists all over Austin.
Yeah.
Every place had a waiting list. The shortest wait he could find was 6 months out.
6 months. It's such a long time to go without care, especially when it's medication that's helping with both physical and mental health.
It is. And during those 6 months, Colin went through a lot. His hormone levels dropped, his period came back, his voice started to change, and he was in a lot of pain.
So not only was his transition put on hold, but his body was forced back into a state that caused him distress.
Exactly. It was really hard for him. He was often unable to get out of bed or go to work. The article mentions a quote that really stuck with me. He said, "And thank God, because I got to the point that I could not go another week. I wanted to die, not because of my thoughts, but because I was hurting so much."
That's a powerful quote. It really shows just how desperate the situation got for him.
It does. And it underscores how important access to consistent quality healthcare is for trans individuals.
Couldn't agree more. Because how did Colin finally get back on track with his care? Did he end up leaving Texas to find a doctor?
He thought about it, but in the end, he was able to get help in Texas.
It wasn't easy, though.
This is where Planned Parenthood comes in, right? I remember the article mentioned they've seen a huge increase in people seeking gender-affirming care since these laws went into effect. Yes, you're exactly right. After weeks of searching and dead ends, Colin got a last-minute appointment at Planned Parenthood.
Wow.
They refilled his testosterone prescription and helped him find a new care team.
It sounds like Planned Parenthood has been crucial in filling the gap in care created by these laws.
They have Laura Terrell, the CEO of Planned Parenthood South Texas, said their demand for gender-affirming care has quadrupled since 2018.
Wow.
A lot of what they're doing now involves educating patients about their rights and reassuring them about the care they can still access in Texas.
It's amazing that they're providing that support, especially when there's so much misinformation and fear out there.
It's essential.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting that they're facing pushback, too,
Yeah.
from people who support the legislation.
That makes sense. So even with these efforts to give care and support, there's still tension and conflict. It sounds like a difficult situation all around.
It is. And this brings us to a really interesting part of Colin's story. His decision about whether to stay in Texas or move to a more supportive state.
Right. The article mentioned his father even offered to help him relocate. It seems like leaving would make sense, right?
It would.
If he's facing so much trouble getting care and dealing with this environment, why not move somewhere he feels safer and more supported?
It's a question a lot of trans people in Texas are asking themselves right now. But Colin's decision to stay and his reasons for it offer some really important insights into how complex this issue really is.
Okay. I'm definitely interested to hear more about that. Let's take a minute to think about everything we've covered so far, and then we'll dive into that next chapter of Colin's story. So we're back and ready to hear more about Colin's decision to stay in Texas. It would have been completely understandable if he'd chosen to leave, after everything.
Would have. And a lot of trans people are making that choice, going to states that are more supportive legally and socially. But Colin's story is a little different. He decided to stay in Texas and actually fight for trans rights, even with all the challenges.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. Why did he decide to stay?
He felt a responsibility to his community. In the article, he says they want us to leave because the more of us that leave, the less people there will be to fight. But I want to stay because as long as there's one trans person in Texas, then there are trans people in Texas.
That's incredible. He's not backing down even when it would be so much easier to just leave.
Exactly. And he knows that leaving wouldn't solve the problem. For the people who stay behind, it might even make things worse.
That's a good point. His decision to stay is almost an act of defiance, like he's refusing to be pushed out.
It is.
Yeah.
And it also shows that there's still hope. Despite everything he's going through, Colin believes things can change. He's committed to making things better for trans people in Texas.
That's really inspiring. It's a reminder that even when things seem impossible, one person can make a difference.
Absolutely. And he's not alone in this. The article mentions he's got a strong support system in Texas, including his girlfriend, who's also committed to staying and fighting for change.
It's so important to have those people around you, especially when you're facing this kind of adversity.
It really is. It just shows you the power of community when it comes to fighting for social justice.
You mentioned earlier that Colin got back on track with his care through Planned Parenthood. Did the article say anything about his experience with those new providers?
Yes, it did. He was able to connect with them and get back on a stable hormone regimen. He's feeling better physically and mentally, and he even found a new job he enjoys.
That's great to hear. It sounds like he's been able to rebuild his life and find some stability despite everything.
He has.
Yeah.
It really shows his resilience and how determined he is. But it also shows the ongoing challenges and uncertainties for trans people in Texas.
Yeah, even though he found new providers, access to care is still limited and the political climate isn't exactly welcoming.
Right, and that's where the bigger picture comes in. Colin's story is just one example of how these laws are impacting trans people, their families, and healthcare providers.
I think I read that the upcoming legislative session could bring even more restrictions.
Unfortunately, that's a real possibility. And it just highlights how fragile the progress we've made really is. The fight for trans rights is far from over. It needs constant attention and action.
It sounds like a really uncertain and potentially dangerous time to be trans in Texas.
It is, and it makes it even more important that we understand what's at stake. We need to challenge the misinformation and fear that are driving these laws.
Absolutely. So as we keep exploring this, I think it's important to remember that Colin's story isn't just about one person. It's about a much bigger battle for trans rights that's happening all across the country.
I agree. Colin's experience shows us that policies aimed at one group can have these huge consequences for others. It really emphasizes how interconnected social justice movements are. The fight for trans rights is tied to the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, reproductive rights, and racial justice.
It's all connected. We can't address these things separately. They're all part of a bigger fight for equality and dignity.
Exactly. And Colin's story also reminds us that individual voices can create change. He's not a politician or a celebrity. He's an ordinary person who decided to stand up and tell his truth, and inspiring others to do the same.
It really shows that we can all play a part in creating a more just and equitable world.
We can. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just refuse to be silenced. Colin's decision to stay in Texas and fight is a perfect example of that.
I agree. His story is a real beacon of hope in a time when things feel so uncertain. And it's a call to action for all of us to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard. So as we start wrapping up Colin's journey, I'm curious what you think about the future of trans rights in Texas and beyond. What are some key takeaways you hope people will get from this deep dive?
I think there are a few important things to remember as we think about what we've learned. First, Colin's story shows just how crucial access to healthcare is. Gender-affirming care is essential. It's not a luxury. It can really impact the lives of trans people, both physically and mentally.
Right. Denying access to that care is discrimination, plain and simple. And it puts people's lives at risk.
Exactly. And the second thing is, Colin's experience shows us that legislation can have unintended consequences. The Texas laws targeting trans youth were supposed to protect children, but we've seen how they've actually hurt trans adults too, limiting their care and creating a climate of fear.
It shows that we need to think carefully about the ripple effects of policies, especially when they're targeting groups that are already marginalized.
Exactly. And finally, Colin's story is a testament to resilience and how important community support is. He faced these huge challenges, but he found a way to keep going, partly because of the support from people he loved and organizations like Planned Parenthood.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always hope and people fighting for a better future. So as we close out this deep dive, what final thought would you leave us with? What's the one thing you hope everyone takes away from this conversation?
The most important message is that the fight for trans rights is a fight for human rights. It's about equality, dignity, and the freedom to be yourself. And it's a fight we can all be part of.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think Colin's story is a great example of why this fight matters. His courage, his resilience, and his commitment to his community are really inspiring.
Yeah, it really shows you that even when things are really tough, there's still hope,
Yeah.
and that change is possible. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all the stuff the trans community is going through, but Colin's story gives you that little spark of hope.
It does. And I think it highlights something we talked about before about the ripple effects of laws. How policies meant for one group can really impact others. We have to be aware of how connected everything is in society and fight for solutions that protect everyone.
It's like you said before, that thing about throwing a rock in a pond. You only see the splash at first, but then the ripples go everywhere and affect things you didn't even think about.
Exactly. And with laws like these in Texas, those ripples can really hurt vulnerable communities. So, what can our listeners do to help create a better environment for trans people in Texas and everywhere else?
Well, there are a lot of ways to get involved and make a difference. I think one of the biggest things is just staying informed. Read articles, listen to podcasts, follow activists and organizations that are working on trans rights. The more you know about the issues, the better you can fight for change.
It's like they say knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. And once you're informed, don't be afraid to speak up. Challenge misinformation when you see it online or in person even. Talk to your elected officials and tell them what you think. Support organizations that are helping trans people directly, like Planned Parenthood, the Transgender Law Center, the Human Rights Campaign.
Those are all great ideas. And I think it's important to remember that even small things can make a difference. Sharing an article on social media or talking to a friend or family member about trans rights can help spread awareness and maybe change some minds.
It can. And those conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, sometimes are so important. We need to break down the stigma around trans identities.
I agree. And Colin's story is a good way to start those conversations. It makes the issue real and helps you understand what these laws actually do to people.
It does. It reminds us that this isn't just about politics and laws. It's about real people whose lives are being affected.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, what's your final thought? What's the one thing you really want people to take away from this?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. The fight for trans rights is a fight for everyone's rights. It's about equality and dignity and being able to be who you are. And it's a fight we can all be a part of.
I love that. And I think Colin's story shows us that even when things are tough, hope and resilience can win. He decided to stay in Texas and fight for his rights, and that's something we can all learn from.
It is. It shows that we can all make a difference, even if it seems small. Every voice matters. Every little bit of support helps.
So, to everyone listening, keep Colin's story with you. Let it inspire you to stay informed, stay involved, and never give up hope. The fight for a better world goes on, and we need everyone to be a part of it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And until next time, stay curious.